Thank you. I'd like to thank Phyllis Lyons and the Freedom Forum from hosting this event. It's a special opportunity for me to be able to talk in detail about Srebrenica and my book. I'd like to talk briefly about how the lessons of the fall of Srebrenica apply to the current situation in Bosnia following last Thursday's arrests, and also briefly describe the book to you. My goal here is to sort of provoke discussion and ideas. I saw this book as sort of a first effort to get at the truth of what happened in Srebrenica and approach some questions about human nature that I, frankly, am not sure I answered fully in my research, and I hope together we can come to some conclusions. My book, Endgame, follows the experiences of 7 people, these were real people, through the attack and fall of Srebrenica. The book covers the 10-day period that were the turning point of the war in Bosnia. According to the International Red Cross, there are currently 7,079 men missing from Srebrenica, and according to this, Srebrenica appears to be the worst single atrocity in Europe since World War II. The 5 people I follow through this book, there are 3 Bosnian Muslims. One of them is Jamila Omanovic. She's a housewife and an accountant who was sort of stunned by the beginning of the war. And after Srebrenica falls, she finds herself negotiating for the fate of the town's 30,000 women and children. And she's negotiating face-to-face with General Ratko Mladic, the Bosnian Serb army commander, who at that point was one of the most feared war criminals in Bosnia. Another person I follow was Hiram Suljic. He's a 55-year-old carpenter who had fallen and shattered his right leg in an accident before the war. He flees to the UN base in Srebrenica after the town falls and expects to be protected by the Dutch peacekeepers in the town. He is instead separated from his wife and grandchildren and taken away for questioning as a suspected war criminal. He eventually survives a mass execution. Mevlud Noric is a 25-year-old soldier in Srebrenica, a Bosnian Muslim. He, too, tries to flee the fallen town through the woods. There were 15,000 men from Srebrenica who tried to make it to central Bosnia in safety. Only half of them appear to have survived. Mevludin also survives a mass execution. 2 of the central characters are Dutch peacekeepers. Private Mark Klaver and Lieutenant Vincent Egbers shared their stories with me, and they are basically, to a certain extent, idealistic soldiers who find themselves trapped in an impossible situation, who I believe were sent on an unfair mission by the United Nations, the Security Council, and their own government. And finally, the last 2 characters are on the Bosnian Serb side. One of them asked me not to use his real name. I call him Zoran Radic in the book. He's a Bosnian Serb policeman who finds several dozen helpless prisoners before him. They're all old Muslim men after Srebrenica falls. And Zoran, as I call him, decides instead of taking advantage of the situation, he saves 2 of his former school teachers, 2 elderly men. The other men in that group were led away that night and haven't been seen since. And the last person I follow is Dražen Ardemović, who's a Bosnian Croat who was fighting with the Bosnian Serbs. And he suddenly finds himself, according to his testimony at the International War Crimes Tribunal, a member of an execution squad with prisoners and old men being lined up in front of him. He's given a choice between firing at the prisoners and saving his own life, and Mr. Ardemović chose to save his own life. Again, through these various characters, I try to address larger questions of human nature, how we do these things to each other, and how we can rationalize as these events occur. I found a pattern throughout the fall of Srebrenica of leaders betraying their people. The book was an attempt to expose those responsible and expose how our capacity to rationalize seems unlimited. The lowest point and the most disturbing point to me was in Potocari, the UN base in Srebrenica after the town had fallen. Old men were being led away for questioning by Bosnian Serbs. Bosnian Muslim women who were there saw these old men as innocent victims who deserved protection. Dutch peacekeepers who were there saw the old men as problems that they didn't necessarily want to have to be responsible for or deal with. And Bosnian Serbs, looking at the exact same old men, saw them as war criminals from World War II who deserved to be shot. I'll quickly run through Mevludin Oric's story because I think it's a good example of the fall of the town and interweave with that the actions of UN commanders in the UN headquarters in Zagreb that I believe could have saved Srebrenica. I believe it's important through these people to bring the story to life and make it understandable. Mevlud Noric was 25 years old. He's skinny. He's a little bit taller than I am. He grew up in a village outside of Srebrenica named Lehovici, went to a local vocational school, wanted to be a miner. The main activity in Srebrenica was mining. Srebrenica actually means silver city in Serbo-Croatian, and since Roman times, silver has been mined from Srebrenica. By 1991, it was a normal city in Yugoslavia. There was a car brake, car battery factory in town, and most apartments had VCRs and cars. Very typical to living situation here in the United States or in Western Europe. Mevlud Norwich watched as the Srebrenica safe area was created. French General Philippe Morillon entered the town in March 1993, and without orders from his superiors, after he was blocked from leaving the town by women and children from Srebrenica, General Morillon stood in the post office window and using a megaphone announced to the people of Srebrenica, "You are now under the protection of the United Nations. I will never abandon you." General Morillon had no orders from his superiors to do this, but the UN Security Council eventually followed his declaration of a safe area and created 6 safe areas in Bosnia, the first one being Srebrenica. But when the UN Security Council requested 30,000 troops to protect the safe areas, they received only 7,000 troops, and the United States, one of the prime backers of the creation of the safe areas, sent no troops. For the next 3 years, life in Srebrenica was better. Mevlud spent much of his time hunting with his cousin Haris. One of the real treats in town was when they were able to rig a VCR and TV with a water wheel they had fashioned nearby to create electricity, and people would watch Arnold Schwarzenegger movies and Jean-Claude Van Damme movies to pass the time. The attack on Srebrenica began on July 6th, and Mevlud remembers standing on a local hillside watching Serb rockets careen into Srebrenica town and feeling confident that the United Nations would quickly send in NATO planes to retaliate against the Serbs and halt the attack. What he did not know was the view of UN commanders in Zagreb of what was happening in Srebrenica. And I want to be clear here that I don't contend that UN commanders were callous or necessarily Machiavellian in their decision-making. They may well have been, but it was fascinating to me to find the pattern, again, of rationalizations and the vastly different way the conflict was viewed by various people who were there. And I think it's important to understand how this happened. In Zagreb, as the attack on Srebrenica intensified, the commander of UN forces in Bosnia, a French general named Bernard Janvier, was convinced that the fact that the Serbs were advancing so quickly on Srebrenica was a Muslim trick. He felt that the Bosnian Muslims were not fighting the Serbs and preventing them from approaching Srebrenica town itself because they were trying to draw the UN into the war. 2 weeks before the Serb attack on Srebrenica, the Bosnian government in Sarajevo had ordered a raid from Srebrenica itself. It had resulted in the burning of a Serb village outside of Srebrenica called Višnica. 3 Serbs were killed in that raid. The Bosnian government had ordered the raid as part of their offensive to liberate Sarajevo, but it was seized on by General Janvier as an example of a provocation by Bosnian Muslims to get the Serbs to attack the town, and then that would lead the UN to attack the Bosnian Serbs. Earlier in the spring, General Janvier had recommended that the UN withdraw from Srebrenica. He felt it was no longer the UN was no longer necessary to defend the towns. His military estimate was that the Bosnian Muslim soldiers in the town were able to defend it himself. That morning, the morning of July 10th, the day before the town falls, I was able to get detailed accounts of the deliberations that went on in UN headquarters, and General Janvier stated to his aides, in terms of Srebrenica, the Bosnians are trying to lead us down a path we don't want to take, referring to the raid from the safe area and the subsequent Serb attack. Yasushi Akashi, the civilian head of the mission, agreed with him, saying, the Bosnian government makes mistakes and then asks the United Nations to come in and take care of the situation for them. That night, the Dutch peacekeepers sent what would be their 4th request for close air support, which was sending NATO planes to attack Bosnian Serbs who were attacking the town. At that point, General Janvier again deliberated for a long period with his aides. At the end of the deliberation, he cited the fact that darkness had come, the Serb attack had halted, and he said that he had spoken to a Serb general. And General Janvier said that General Tolomir told me that the Serbs do not intend to take Srebrenica. Janvier stated to his aides in this private meeting, I believe him. If I'm wrong, I'll draw my conclusions in the morning. The next day, Srebrenica fell. As I stated earlier, about 30,000 women, children, and elderly men fled to the UN base inside in Potočarja village north of Srebrenica. And there, one of the characters in my book, Mark Klaver, and again we get back to the rationalization, begins to help Bosnian Serbs as they try to control the crowd and as they are separating old men from their families instead of allowing the old men to be bussed out of Srebrenica as the women were. Mark Klaver sincerely believed he was doing the right thing and still believes he was doing the right thing by helping the Serbs. And he described to me One especially poignant moment and his own confusion as he was forming a human wall holding back, linking his arms with other Dutch peacekeepers, and there were Bosnian Muslim women pressing forward, fighting viciously to get on the buses to leave the town. Some of the women would cry and kiss him on the cheek and thank him for helping them get on the buses. Others would curse him and call him a Nazi. On a hilltop outside of Srebrenica, the 15,000 men who were preparing to leave the town had gathered to make the 40-mile trek through Bosnian Serb or enemy territory. Of those men was Mevludin Oric and his cousin Haris, his father, and 45 men from his home village of Lehovici. Soon after the group departed, they were ambushed in a place called Kamenica, and Mevludin was captured. The first guard who held him actually apologized to his prisoners. This was a Serb guard. He said to Mevludin and his Muslim prisoners before him, the Serb said, "I'd like to let you go, but I don't dare do it. I never wanted this war. I had Muslim neighbors. I told them I didn't want to fight, and I was beaten." I found several instances of Bosnian Serbs actually trying to help prisoners, and I think it's crucial to not blame all Serbs for what went on. And I think these individuals show how guilty those who did carry out atrocities are. Mevludin was then taken to a school gym after spending the night on a truck. 2 years ago tonight, that's July 14th, 1995, Mevludin Oric found himself in a gym with approximately 800 other prisoners. The crowd was mixed. There were some men who tried to make it through the woods and been captured in ambushes. The other men were old men who'd gone to the UN base for protection but been taken away for questioning. He saw General Ratko Mladic, the commander of the Bosnian Serb army, appear at the front of that gym 2 years ago tonight. General Mladic spoke to his aides, joked with them and laughed, and left the room. Soon after he left, groups of 20 prisoners were taken to a side room, and when it came to be Mevludin's turn, he and his cousin Haris got up, went to the side room, and when he arrived there, he found one of the men from Lehovici, his home village. The man was placing blindfold on each of the prisoners. Mevludin asked the man, "What's going to happen to us?" And his neighbor didn't respond. He simply started to weep. The 20 men were loaded in the back of a van, driven down a road for 5 minutes. Mevludin remembers being disoriented. He wasn't sure where he was going or what was happening. The back door of the van swung open abruptly, and Mevludin remembers being pulled outside as Serbs shouted for him to stand up and move forward. He remembered hearing his cousin Haris's voice shouting out his name, and he made his way to his cousin. Once he got near him, he took his cousin's hand, and his cousin Haris said to Mevludin, "They're going to kill us, they're going to kill us." And Mevludin, trying to calm himself and his cousin, said, "No, you're wrong." Just then, the Bosnian Serb execution squad opened up on the group of prisoners. Mevludin remembers falling forward and feeling a heavy weight fall on top of him. He also remembers hearing his cousin Haris cry out briefly and then squeeze his hand very tightly. Mevludin lay still beneath the bodies. He was sure he was dead. And he listened as the Serb executioners began moving through the bodies and firing a bullet into the heads of each of the prisoners to make sure they were dead. Mevludin first heard a shot about 10 to 20 feet to his right, then another shot closer, 5 feet away, then a third shot even closer. He waited for the bullet to hit him, and he felt a boot step on his leg. Somehow, he stayed still. He then heard a shot to his left, and then a second shot to his left, and he realized that the Serbs thought he was dead. For the next 6 hours, Mevludin Oric lay beneath the corpse on top of him, playing dead and somehow maintaining his composure. He listened as a backhoe came in and began to dig a mass grave. He heard men cry out as they were buried alive, but he somehow stayed still. He felt ants crawl on his chest and bite his face, which was covered with other people's blood, but he still maintained his composure and lay still. As the afternoon passed, at first the Serbs, and again we get into questions of human nature here, taunted their victims. They said to the old men, "Old Grandpa, Grandpa, are you hurt? Are you hurt? Tell me so I can help you." Any old man that answered would be shot in the head. But as the day went by, the Serbs themselves seemed to lose their nerve. They started to argue over who should fire the bullets into the heads of the wounded prisoners. And in the end, the youngest soldier was ordered to do it, as the oldest soldiers weren't willing to do it themselves. And finally, at the end of the day, after nightfall, when the gym had been emptied, the Serbs couldn't agree on who should stay in the field and guard the prisoners. They finally left that night, leaving Mevludin alone. He finally crawled out from beneath the corpse. And at first, when he tried to run, he told me, this is one of the reasons I believed his story, he couldn't move his legs because they'd fallen asleep from the weight of the body on top of him from so long. As he got up to leave, he turned and realized that the body that he'd been hiding under was his cousin Horace. He made his way to the woods and was sort of eager to tell the world of what he had lived through. The other man to survive was Hiram Sulic, the crippled carpenter. He too had been brought to the same gym. He too had been loaded in the back of the same type of truck. Except in his truck, he had looked around him and noticed that of the men in the truck, at 55 years old, he was the youngest man in the back of the truck. Hiram described a similar situation where men realized what was going to happen to them, but somehow tried to rationalize that it just would never happen. He describes old men starting to mutter the names of their granddaughters as the truck rounded the last curve. And he described simply lining up, knowing what was about to happen, and his mind going blank. He said he was unable to grasp his own mortality. Of the 45 men who left Lehovici with Mevlut and Orich, only 15 survived. That's a 70% casualty rate. 4 out of 5 of the men from Lehovici are missing. There are entire male sides of families that have been wiped out. There's one girl from Lehovici who has no father, no uncles, and no grandfathers. I met Mevlut and Orich in September of 1995. I'd already made one trip into Bosnian Serb territory using a copy of a satellite picture the U.S. had released of a suspected grave to get to a village called Nova Kasaba. In that village, I found documents with Muslim names on them, empty ammunition boxes, and jutting from the ground a decomposed human leg. I then went and found as many survivors as I could of the mass executions in September. One of them was Mevlutin, and in October, I returned to Bosnian Serb territory after an intelligence source leaked to me the location of even more suspected mass graves that the U.S. had satellite photos of, but had not released to the public. I remember my first goal was to find the grave that Mevlutin had survived. He later described a set of railroad tracks being in that area, and I remember passing over the railroad tracks and stopping my car, expecting I was roughly in the area where the graves were. But as soon as I stopped the car, I looked to my left and saw a large swath of fresh digging. The rich brown dirt that had recently been dug up was covered with white dots. And as I got out of the car and walked towards the dots, they became eyeglasses, shoes, and civilian clothes scattered across the top of the grave. I found jackets in the woods and civilian clothes. Inside the clothes were IDs from Muslim men from Srebrenica. And confirming Mevlutin's account and Hiram's account of old men being taken there, I found 3 canes in the pile of civilian clothes, confirming that elderly men had been brought there and shot. I was arrested later that day at another execution site by Bosnian Serbs. And I can talk about it if you want under questioning, and I don't discuss it in the book that much, because compared to what these people survived, I didn't think that my experience was nearly as important, or I wasn't nearly as courageous as they were. The only interesting thing that struck me in jail was I had 6 Serb guards who guarded me at all times. The main one who was in charge of guarding me seemed sincerely convinced that I was a CIA agent. He kept speaking to me and telling me, Mr. David, that's what he called me, Mr. David, you're very clever, but you are not clever enough. If you wish to go free, you must answer the 3 important questions. What is your rank? Who is your commander in the CIA? And what is your mission? I laughed at first, but they continued to do this for the next 3 days of interrogation. And what struck me was how sincerely the Serbs believed the propaganda they'd been fed over the last 3.5 years at that point, and at this point, 5 years. And in terms of my guards, I found that 2 of the guards seemed to enjoy scaring me and telling me that I was a spy and that I'd be shot. But 2 other ones seemed to get just as much joy out of actually helping me and telling me that I'd be out of jail soon and nothing would happen to me because I was an American. And I had 2 other guards who simply seemed to not pay attention and simply follow the others. And I found this to be a pattern in Srebrenica itself, and that not all Bosnian Serbs committed atrocities. There seemed to be groups of Serbs who repeatedly committed rape and other atrocities. Other Bosnian Serbs who were courageous enough to defend their friends and try to save lives. But most Bosnian Serbs, and I think most people in any group, simply kept their heads down and tried to save their own lives first, which again gets back to questions of human nature. I was released by the Bosnian Serbs after 10 days, thanks to pressure from the Clinton administration, the Committee to Protect Journalists, and 12 members of my family and 2 of my editors flew to the Dayton peace talks in Ohio and pushed for my release. I was very lucky, and I'm very grateful to them. To sum up, 2 years after the fall of Srebrenica, few lessons seem to have been learned from the Srebrenica tragedy. Controversies and questions remain. In my book, I conclude that General Bernard Janvier, either because he was incompetent or Machiavellian, failed to follow the orders given to him by the UN Security Council. He was to use, quote, the necessary measures, end quote, to defend the safe areas. General Janvier did not. I found out that after Srebrenica's fall, on July 24th, in a meeting with the Dutch defense minister and other Dutch officials, General Janvier said that the Bosnian government had intentionally sacrificed Srebrenica. He believed there was a secret order from Sarajevo for the men in Srebrenica to not fight. There was no such order. He also argued that the Bosnian government could have easily liberated Sarajevo but chose not to because it was interested in creating international sympathy. General Janvier repeatedly argued that the Bosnian government snipers were shooting French soldiers in Sarajevo but trying to make it like the Serbs had shot them, and again blaming the Bosnian government. And there's this pattern of sort of these conspiracies and this attempt to rationalize not acting to defend the safe areas and to blame the Bosnian governments, theoretically the victims of the war, for what occurred. For 2 years, General Janvier has turned down all interview requests and never publicly explained his decision to block the crucial request for NATO planes in Srebrenica. Yasushi Akashi, I believe, was responsible for encouraging a mindset in Zagreb that suspected the Bosnians and held the neutrality of the UN as the most valuable thing they could maintain, to the point where the UN was too interested in neutrality, was so interested in neutrality that it was unable to carry out its own mission. I found that in a private meeting with Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic on August 8th, it was Mr. Akashi, General Janvier, and the Serbian President. I found the callousness, I believe, of their attitudes towards the safe area, or at least the fact that they seem to be removed from the reality of the war itself in Bosnia. General Janvier used to state that his subordinates who were in Bosnia couldn't think clearly about the war itself because they were in the war itself. He would complain that in French that they were in le milieu bosniaque and couldn't see clearly the war, whereas he could in Zagreb. I believe he was wrong. In this meeting on August 8th, Mr. Akashi is having lunch with the Serbian president. They are looking out over a deck, and Mr. Akashi asks the Serbian president if there are any deer or bear in the area. President Milosevic responds, yes, there are, but there's no hunting within a few kilometers of this hunting lodge. Mr. Akashi then makes a joke. This is a month after Srebrenica has fallen and 8,000 men are missing. Mr. Akashi says, oh, I see, a safe area for animals. The entire table burst out laughing. In my book, I call for General Janvier to be compelled to explain his actions. If 7,000 French or 7,000 Americans or 7,000 British were missing, the UN general in command at the time would have been forced to explain his actions. Instead, General Janvier has been promoted and is living comfortably in Paris. Yasushi Akashi has also been promoted and is here in New York. Not a single UN official, Dutch peacekeeper, or French, British, or American intelligence official has been punished or reprimanded for their conduct during the fall of Srebrenica. The Byzantine UN command chain and other bureaucratic problems contributed to the chaos in Srebrenica. While internal reviews of peacekeeping operations are being conducted, no major changes in peacekeeping operations has been implemented that I know of at this point. The UN declined to send a representative here tonight to discuss the fall of Srebrenica, which I believe is the darkest hour in United Nations history. At this point, only approximately 30% of the mass graves around the enclave have been exhumed, frankly to my surprise. A combination of a lack of funds to the International War Crimes Tribunal and bureaucratic delays have led to this problem. This summer's exhumations only began this week. 2 months of warm weather were missed. The War Crimes Tribunal has been reduced to soliciting contributions to pay for its exhumations around Srebrenica, and it currently has only half of the $2.2 million it needs to carry out this summer's exhumations. The United States decreased its contributions for exhumations from $1 million last year to $450,000 this year, and the only other countries to contribute to the exhumations are Austria, Canada, Malaysia, Holland, Sweden, and Switzerland. Obviously, the names of several other major industrial powers are missing. Most Serbs at this point dismiss the allegations of mass executions after the fall of Srebrenica as a ruse. I believe until Bosnian Serbs are confronted with proof of their leadership's war crimes, it will be difficult to get Serb public opinion to turn against Radovan Karadzic or Ratko Mladic, which is a crucial consideration considering the recent arrests in Bosnia. Exhumations in the end may prove to be one of the most crucial aspects of the peace process. Bosnian Serbs must be confronted by what Bosnian Serb ultranationalists have done, just as Germans were confronted with Nazi atrocities in World War II. If the number of missing is 10,000, as the Bosnian government claims, or only a few hundred, as Bosnian Serbs claim, so be it. An accurate accounting must be made. There's a desperate need for a history all sides can roughly agree on in the former Yugoslavia that never existed in World War II, and Bosnian Serb nationalists played on Serb sense of no justice after World War II to compel people to fight in this war. At present, Serbs view themselves as the victims of an international conspiracy. They view themselves as the war's victims. I was in Sarajevo last week and was stunned to see that this mentality had sort of increased on the Serb side. The economic suffering there on their side is intense. It's far worse off than the Federation side, but Bosnian Serbs continue to blame the West and not their leaders for their plight. Finally, I hope that the West is learning lessons about the use of force in regional conflicts. Sending soldiers into a foreign country with no political will to sustain casualties may handicap military officers and their ability to protect their own men. In Srebrenica, a fear of casualties helped lead to the fall of the town. Instead of a few Dutch soldiers dying in a successful defense of the town that may have blunted the Serb attack, all 450 Dutch peacekeepers ended up disarmed and completely at the mercy of the Bosnian Serbs. One of the lessons of the war in Bosnia was that officers must be allowed to suffer some casualties if they are to be able to defend their units. If political leaders and military commanders are going to deploy troops, they must be ready to suffer casualties. Half-hearted efforts will fail and backfires. False expectations of a zero-casualty conflict have emerged from the Gulf War, I believe, that are unrealistic. Following last Thursday's arrest, I believe the West again stands at a watershed in Bosnia. Threats of retaliation from Bosnian Serbs are widespread, but I believe it's crucial that the West not blink at this time. The arrests must continue, but they must be combined with an intenser effort to inform Bosnian Serbs of the evidence against their leadership. There is a danger of Radovan Karadzic and Ratko Mladic becoming martyrs to Bosnian Serbs. Bosnian Croats who have been indicted by the War Crimes Tribunal must also be arrested, and the International War Crimes Tribunal must also be fully implemented and must act impartially. There are allegations of Bosnian Muslims in Srebrenica committing war crimes against Bosnian Serbs in 1993. If that is true, then they too should be prosecuted for their war crimes. The credibility of the tribunal has never been more important. One lesson from Srebrenica for all of us is that human beings can be conditioned to do anything. One of the greatest dangers for all of us, it appears, is our ability to rationalize. Myself and other journalists told ourselves that Srebrenica would not fall so quickly. I didn't believe that this many men could have been executed. I was wrong. Dutch peacekeepers thought they were doing the right thing by helping the Serbs expel Srebrenica's women and children. They thought by not fighting the Serbs they could maintain their neutrality and that the Serbs would respect their neutrality after the town had fallen, and that the Serbs would not kill that many people, or as many people as they did. Bosnian Serb executioners, as far as I can tell and the evidence I have, sincerely believed they were doing the right thing and what they were doing was justified. And General Janvier may very well have believed that letting Srebrenica fall was the right thing to do, and that for some reason the Bosnian government deserved it. And one final note, I believe there's a lesson for policymakers that foreign interventions that are half-hearted can do more harm than good. This was not the case of the international community ignoring a far-off atrocity. The United Nations peacekeepers partially disarmed the men of Srebrenica and then turned them over to their executioners. Bosnians themselves insist there would have been less casualties if Srebrenica had been allowed to fall in 1993. In my book, I conclude that the actions of the international community aided, encouraged, and emboldened the executioners. And quickly, there are two futures that we face in Bosnia. One is reflected by a conversation I had with Nasser Oric, the Bosnian Muslim commander of Srebrenica. I spoke to him briefly when I was finishing my research on my book, and I was on my way to interview a Serb general who led the attack on Srebrenica. And I asked Nasser Oric if he had a message for the Serb commander. Nasser told me yes. Tell him the score is 1-0. A second anecdote is again about Mevludin Oric, who survived the execution by hiding beneath his cousin. I saw him last week and I asked him if I could still tell this anecdote, if his feelings were still true, and he said he did. I asked him what he wanted me to tell people in the United States. He said that all he wanted was to give his cousin a proper burial. I was in a bar with Mevludin Oric last March. He was very drunk. He sat down across the table from me, and there were two men sitting on either side of him. This was in Tuzla, which still is fairly mixed and has Serbs and Croats still in the area. Mevludin, who is Muslim, turned the man to his right, and he put his arm around the man to his right, and he said, this man has helped me so much since I came out of my woods. I'm sorry, since I came out of the woods. He is my friend, you know, and I can't thank him enough. And Mevlut turned, he put his arm around the man to his left, and he said, this man is a Serb. He's been my great friend since I came out of the woods. And he stayed on our side, and I cannot thank him enough. Mevlut then pulled both of these men very close to him, and he said, this is my Bosnia, this is my Bosnia. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to take any questions. Sorry if I went on for too long.
Just raise your hand if you got a question, and we'll get a mic to you.
Hi, I'm Sheila Owens with the Media Studies Center. I'd like to know where you stand on journalists being required to testify as witnesses of war crimes.
I don't think they should be required to do it. I am not in that. I don't have to testify because there was eventual access to these graves. I did think about it personally, and I guess I decided that if I was no longer covering that story, it might be appropriate for me to testify. If there was no other source to possibly prove that these graves existed, that would be the one occasion when it might be worthwhile.
Hi, hello. Yeah, Rory O'Connor from Global Vision. I'm a little puzzled about your use of the word "the rationale." So let me ask a more direct question: would you agree that the UN is complicit in the genocide at Srebrenica, or is that too strong from your point of view?
I would say it's too strong. I mean, I was desperate to speak with General Janvier, and he refused to speak to me, and he refused to speak to everyone. He may have had some other information that night as to why he sent back the planes, but there is this clear pattern of him recommending that the UN pull out of the safe area, and then him, over the objections of all of his advisors that night, saying he believes the Serbs. And I think it's important to focus the attention here on the Bosnian Serbs who attacked the town itself and who carried out these executions when they didn't. I say that because I've been asked before whether I thought that General Janvier or Mr. Kashi should be indicted by the War Crimes Tribunal for their conduct. And I think it's ridiculous that there's no mechanism for, I think, policing peacekeepers and what they do. We've heard the stories about Somalia in terms of misconduct. There's only, I think, a court-martial that's allowed under each individual military's system, which doesn't appear to be very thorough. So I would see them more as negligent. And I don't know if I'm splitting hairs with the words, but more negligent. I don't think. And one of General Janvier's close aides told me that the general did not believe that this many people would die. He trusted the Serbs.
How many did you think would die?
One of the problems, again, with the UN mission was that he had just come in that January, and this rotation of commanders and rotation of troops led these people with very short memories. So the only thing that General Janvier had actually seen in the conflict was the spring of 1995, which consisted of the Croatian army taking back a chunk of Serb territory called Western Slavonia, which appeared to be very clean, even though I don't think it was, but it appeared to the UN to have gone fairly cleanly. And then he saw the Bosnian army launching some offensives in central Bosnia. And he kept harping on this. His whole view of the conflict was that there was this, both sides were equally armed, and the Bosnians could defend themselves, and they were just trying to trick the UN. I mean, he could either be completely Machiavellian and be arguing this in private and trying to carry out a secret strategy, or he could just be sort of grossly wrong. I mean, he was wrong. Militarily, his assessment was completely wrong.
My name is Nazife Ozankan. I don't belong in any organization, just my own. Asking. Is it all right? May I?
Sure.
What do you think about Muslims? Are they not intelligent or unrealistic or naive? What do you think about them?
Well, I'm not sure I understand your question. I mean, every Muslim is different, just as every American is different. And Bosnian Muslims?
Sure.
Are you discussing? Are you referring to their leadership or the people themselves or all of them? I'd rather not characterize all of them because I think it's totally inaccurate to characterize an entire group by one thing. And I don't know if they were naive. I know that at least in Srebrenica, people sincerely expected the UN to come and protect the town. I don't know if they were naive. I wouldn't say they're naive, but I know they sincerely expected the UN to defend the town of Srebrenica. The acting commander in Srebrenica, they actually had one hidden artillery piece they had hidden since it became a safe area. They'd hidden it for 2 years. And he ordered his men not to fire it because he was afraid that if the one artillery piece they had hidden actually was fired at the Serbs, the town would lose its safe area status. He didn't trust the Dutch. He thought they would take away the safe area status. And there was a lot more chaos and confusion than anything else that I found in Srebrenica.
I represent Russian American Daily. It seems to me that the situation in Yugoslavia not unique in contemporary human history. You mentioned human nature. Do you believe that under some political circumstances, what happened in Yugoslavia can happen it everywhere? And second question, many people, and not only in Russia, believe that main reason, not human nature, but Germany. That's first step, what Germany tried in Europe. What do you think about this?
I'm sorry, the last part of the question about Germany, I'm not sure I understood.
That real reason, main reason, basic reason for situation in Yugoslavia, that the interest of Germany would try to provide same situation in whole Europe. Not in near future, but of course in future. What do you think about this?
In terms of human nature, I do believe this could have happened in any society. The intensity of the Bosnian Serb propaganda is sort of difficult to underestimate, and how sort of simplistic it was also. This Bosnian Serb policeman who actually saved his friends, he said when the war started he was very confused as to which side he should be fighting on, but as he was sitting in a trench around Sarajevo laying siege to the city, he read this book that had been printed in the Serbian capital of Belgrade called Bloody Hands of Islam. And the book described these horrible atrocities carried out by Muslims against Serbs in World War II. And he sort of took this verbatim, and that's sort of what led him to fight in the war. There was one woman I spoke to in Srebrenica who I visited her apartment with a woman named Barbara Demick, a correspondent for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and she was a Serb who had been kicked out of her own home by a Serb attack on the other side of Bosnia, and she was very impressed by the collection of books in this Bosnian Muslim's apartment. Very impressed that this was obviously an intellectual, and this was a Muslim who had all these great Serb writers. But when we just told her that this man was missing, that this man, this intellectual, as she said, had been taken away by the Serbs for questioning and in front of the UN base, she didn't believe us. And her literal response was, I know everyone that went to the UN base was bussed out of Srebrenica. I saw it with my own eyes on TV. And there's a tremendous sort of power of propaganda in this area. This is an area that's been ruled by authoritarian regimes well before Tito, but frankly for centuries. And I think that's why it's crucial that the leadership be changed at the top, and that's why the war crimes are so important. In terms of the interests of Germany, I'm not sure what Germany's interests were, but I think one of the problems in Bosnia was there was, I think, real division between Germany, France, and Britain and the U.S. about what to do in Bosnia. There was a very clear policy on containing it, and everyone was totally agreed on that, and that was very effective. But in terms of actually stopping the war itself, no one could quite agree what to do, or no one was actually willing to risk their own troops to try to stop it. But I'm not sure it's accurate to view sort of Germany as this dominant force that controlled everything that happened there.
Jack David Marcus, Jewish Ad Hoc Committee on Bosnia, Jacob for short. David, I think you are to be commended for your excellent work on the ground and in terms of your public speaking and your wonderful book, period, factoid. My question to you is sort of a twofold one. Genocide and war crimes have been taking place for many years since the Holocaust 50 years ago. My question is, what more can the press do than has been done in identifying and explaining exactly what is happening on the ground so the public gets a real feel and flavor and thus perhaps could influence their government in terms of public policy. That's number one. Number two, as a segue, what can the press do at this juncture to still publicize, like you're doing right now, the issues of war crimes and genocide in Srebrenica and wherever, as a function of supporting the War Crimes Tribunal in The Hague, and then, I guess, in implementing the various conventions that already exist that govern worldwide reactions to war crimes and genocide?
In terms of the press, I don't know. I mean, we and I think it's very important that we stay away from advocacy, and that we sort of, I don't know, I don't want to say just the facts or whatever, but it's important that we not sort of do stories about the War Crimes Tribunal because we think it's important that the War Crimes Tribunal's cause be helped. We should only see it as an important news item. In terms of specific things, that one step that is being made to maybe improve reporting is that Roy Gutman of New York Newsday, who won a Pulitzer for his work in Bosnia, exposing the existence of concentration camps, he's creating a guide that will actually list war crimes, almost a field guide to war crimes for journalists, so that instead of having a story that says, Bosnian Serbs today shelled a hospital, you can say, in an apparent violation of international humanitarian law, Bosnian Serbs shelled a hospital today. And I think it's very important to keep the line separate because it's very important to maintain our credibility as journalists. I tried in this book actually to be very accurate, and when there were anecdotes that I didn't find credible, I didn't include them. And again, I'll repeat that there were some atrocities apparently carried out by Bosnian Muslims in Srebrenica, and if that's true, they need to be, indicted also, I think, and brought to justice. So I just think that sort of good old-fashioned reporting is, as bad an answer as that may sound, maybe the best way to keep the issue going. Go ahead. Yeah, you can.
The Geneva Convention.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the Geneva Convention, other conventions which deal with and govern governments' responses by treaty to war crimes and genocide. I mean, I rarely see articulated in the news stories about what already exists and what the requirements are for governments when these kinds of situations come to the fore.
I think journalists are generally unaware of the exact requirements of those treaties and that kind of stuff. I know that's specifically something that Roy Gutman is working on in his project also. But it's and it could, in a proper context, that could be, and I think would be a much better practice, I think. Back.
In a panel discussion here on the coverage of Bosnia a couple months ago, several reporters and the photographer Gilles Perez were all here, and one buzz that circulated through the room, I thought, was that the problem in Bosnia was not that the war and the atrocities were not covered enough, that through the heroism of reporters like yourself, people were better informed about this genocide than almost any other genocide that I can think of in recent memory, that the problem lay with international authorities, the deployment of international armed force, things very much a step removed from the influence of individual journalists or even news organizations. Does that analysis sound right to you?
Yeah, well, we were, I'm sure critics say that the press was too pro-Bosnian government in the conflict, and we actually over-reported possibly the war. I don't know if I don't think that's true, but I definitely think that's the problem. I mean, there was tons of reporting, and you get to sort of a chicken and an egg problem where public opinion just doesn't seem to care. And it's difficult to know what to do in that situation. Personally, I can't, I'll be honest and express sort of my amazement at the fact that so few of these graves have been dug up 2 years later. I mean, it's absolutely crucial these things be dug up and the numbers be proven here. I mean, this is not a complicated situation, but it hasn't been, at least maybe the media is the problem because we haven't covered it close enough. But throughout, NATO troops have been unwilling to even guard these graves. They've been tampered with. The grave that Mevlud Nort survived, the top layer of bodies had been removed. One of them, frankly, may very well have been his cousin. He keeps asking me about, what's happened at these sites, and it's difficult to respond to him why, we couldn't even guard the graves, let alone exhume them 2 years later. But I don't know, and that's a crucial question, I think, for the media in general. But I, again, would like to err on the side of caution, and you do not want to cross the line into advocacy.
I'm just curious.
Sorry.
Hi, Bernie Flans, Ray Hispano American News. I'm just curious about two things. One, you seem to indicate that World War II and what happened in World War II was the most important things in this genocide. So, did the Muslims in World War II do anything particularly egregious? Two, the breakup of Yugoslavia. In other words, if Yugoslavia had stayed united, if Croatia hadn't wanted to be independent, is it your impression that people would have said, okay, well, let everything go along okay as it is. Let's not take revenge for those World War II mishaps. Would that have happened? Let's say no one had decided to have any independence movements. Do you think they would have said, well, let's forget it and let's call Tito a great hero and humanitarian, and he's responsible for our wonderful happiness?
I think it's in terms of World War II and its effect on this conflict. The Muslims, I think some Muslims were probably guilty of committing egregious things, but I don't think they were anywhere near what Serb propaganda during this war portrayed or not. And I completely disagree with the view of this conflict as sort of these ancient ethnic hatreds, that everybody under Tito was sort of dying to get at each other's throats. I think the key way to view Bosnia and the former Yugoslavia, the dominant culture there is communism, not ancient ethnic hatreds and ethnic rivalry. This was a top-down war. People have, again, they've lived under police structures that have been extremely strong. And one of the most interesting things to me was the success of I-4 and S-4. There were, I think, almost no incidents of sniping or shelling of NATO troops since they've been there. I think which shows that the order from the top was, don't mess with these guys, and people haven't done it. People do what they're told. So I think that this wasn't necessarily bubbling. It was in some areas, I think, bubbling under the surface, but I think it was clearly exploited by the leadership, and that's what led it to happening. And I think war crimes trials after World War II, more thorough ones, would have, I think, led to a reduction of these tensions. You have to look at the success of the Nuremberg trials, at least theoretically, in Western Europe. I mean, people talk about how everyone wants to kill each other in Bosnia, but very, very roughly, the French and the Germans and the British have all fought each other nearly, roughly as many times as the Serbs and Croats and Muslims have. But you don't hear everyone talking about those crazy French. They're just always going to want to kill those Germans. There's nothing you can do about it. So I do think that the process is crucial. I have a friend who's actually studied, or he's currently working on a book about the effect of war crimes tribunals throughout history, and he found that they don't act as a deterrent. That anyone, Pol Pot, is going to go ahead and do this, even if there is an international war crimes tribunal that's been established. But what he did find where they were crucial was in terms of reconciliation afterwards, and the importance of establishing a history that both sides agree on. And right now, I cannot emphasize the black and white in Bosnia, how you speak to Bosnian Serbs, and they are the victims of this war. They have suffered a genocidal attack from Bosnian Muslims, and Bosnian Muslims, and accurately, see themselves as the victims of the war. It's tragic, I think, what's happening to the Serb people.
Sheila Geist from the Coalition for Intervention Against Genocide. David, you said that you wanted to open a discussion on human nature and responsibility in these crisis situations, and I want to ask you a three-part question in view of what you said about human beings can be manipulated to do anything, and that the press, has a certain responsibility to take a view of what's happened rather than to specifically advocate. When your book was reviewed by the Times, the first account was Anthony Lewis gave it a recommendation, briefly, and then that Sunday it was reviewed in the book review, in which the discussion in your book of the charges of Bosnian complicity and responsibility for the fall of Srebrenica and so on, were used by the reviewer to say that, yes, Mladic was there, but essentially the Bosnians sold out Srebrenica, and repeated basically Janvier's charges. And therefore, the American public reading the New York Times review is then manipulated into this complicity again of its government's disinformation and their policy. How do you react to the role of the press in misusing your book this way, and who do you think should answer it? That's part one. Part two.
That's
part two has
that's
to
a real
do
softball.
has to do with the nature of responsibility. Your book talks about the role of the peacekeepers. It talks about the role of individual Serbs in helping people escape. Or I had attended a conference at the Holocaust Museum at the end of May on genocide, religion, and modernity. And at that conference, several genocides had been discussed by historians who were researching particular people who stood up, whether it was for Nazism, against the Armenian genocide, et cetera, and so forth, in Rwanda and so on. And what they came up with, basically, it made good books to write about who saved whom, whether one person even saved their dressmaker. But essentially, it was a question of governments and groups organizing, because the 3 or 10 or 20 people saved would not have stopped the genocide, but it was a matter of official responsibility. So in that case, what did you think that the Dutch peacekeepers should have done? What do you think that is our responsibility in this room, we who now know about the mass graves not being properly exhumed or protected, or in response to the arrest of Mladic, which is not going forward, and the press is insisting is too dangerous for us to proceed with? So those are the two parts.
Does anybody else want to answer that question?
What was the first question?
No, that was. Can we just skip the first one? I know it's part of it. I know. I'm not. I don't want to sort of cop out and give you an answer. I mean, it's a book review, and it's not a a statement of fact. It's not historical record, and but I'll be honest and say that was played up to a certain extent more than I expected in the book review than it was actually in the book itself. Because I tried to come down the hardest of all, obviously, on General Mladic for ordering the executions, but then on the UN and then the Bosnian government itself. I just would say in general, though, there's a lot of views of sort of, I think there's a lot of unconscious bias on the part of any reporter. It's important for you to, and this will sound trite, but keep writing these letters, sort of pointing these things out, and because these people do listen. There's not some sort of big conspiracy at the Christian Science Monitor, the New York Times, where I am now, to kind of, twist the facts and to brainwash the American public. A lot of times it's just mistakes and ignorance. Or not even ignorance, just their viewpoint and stuff. And in terms of responsibility, the specific thing that I wish the one thing the Dutch could have done in Srebrenica was, I think there were many more problems with what the Dutch did after the town fell than before it fell. The Dutch did ask for NATO planes to come in, and General Janvier kept saying no. They could have gotten all these. They could have bluffed more. There could have been an attempt by the Dutch commander to have all the Bosnian Muslims, the 30,000 women and children, they could have fit actually on the grounds of the Dutch base itself. It was a very, very large base. But that he didn't do that. He only let enough in that could fit inside a factory. And that was a very concrete step that could have helped. There could have been more bluffing. I don't know if they could have tried to make more of a public stand. And instead of drawing attention to what the Serbs were doing, there seemed to be a pattern of the Dutch not telling people what the Serbs were doing to try to hide their own complicity possibly in what went on. The Dutch Defense Ministry, gave people a month's vacation after they got out of Srebrenica. And so very few people heard of these accounts of executions and things that the Dutch had seen. In in terms of our responsibility, I mean, I would, I don't know, I would just, urge you again, this is the right answer, but if, push for what you believe in and lobby who you think can make these issues or whatever. But it's again, it's not our role as journalists to be sort of saying what policy should be or shouldn't be, I think.
How about a quick one to close here? I'm Parker Chapman with the Media Studies Center. Tell us really quickly about your captivity and your psyche involved in that captivity, and then your opinion on why the exhumations haven't happened faster and how they could happen faster.
My psyche in captivity. It's great. It was. It wasn't bad. I mean, I didn't think they would do anything to me. I was actually stunned. I remember the strangest moment was standing there and pulling up on this plateau at this earthen dam, and it was exactly like these survivors had explained to me. It was a second site, just like the place I found the canes. And I got out of the car and saw these bones, and I got out of the car and walked towards them and pulled out a camera to take a picture of them. And I heard someone shout, and I turned around, and there was this old man up on the dam, and he had a rifle pointed at me. And I remember looking at him, and he had the rifle right at me, and I yelled out in Serbo-Croatian, "I'm lost," I tried to walk back to the car, and he pulled the sight up real tight on his eye, and he aimed it right at me. And I remember thinking, you know what happened here, and I know what happened here. But just like Hiram Suljic, the execution survivor, I couldn't grasp, what might have happened at that point. So the entire process for me in jail was always thinking, well, it's not that bad, they're going to let me out tomorrow, big deal, and I'm still not, I don't think I was in that much danger. I mean, I think the Serbs would have been foolish to, and I knew as an American they'd treat me better, and I knew that because I'd done these previous stories on Srebrenica, if anything happened to me, they would draw much more attention to what went on. It was an unusual risk. I had never taken that kind of risk before. I did it just because it was such a big story and issue. This is, 7,000 lives. So it's something I hopefully, won't do again or whatever. In terms of the exhumations, there are some people who argue that by exhuming these graves and arresting these people is just going to stir everything up over there, that it's just going to bring back all these hatreds, and everyone there is just sort of going to forget that these executions happen, and people from Srebrenica will just forget that all their male relatives are missing. I mean, that's a serious policy discussion that goes on. There are people who argue that now actively in the Clinton administration and other governments, and that could be one of the reasons. And I strongly disagree with that viewpoint. It's crucial that the truth come out one way or another, whether it's less than 7,000 or more. Both sides, people on all sides. The Serbs do not deserve to be blamed for all of this. It's their leadership that did this.
David, I'd like to thank you for coming by and talking with us this evening. I'm sure you'd be happy to stick around for a little while if anybody else has any questions. I'm sure David would be happy to talk to you personally. There's books for sale in the lobby, and perhaps you would sign them if you would. So please stay around for a little while longer, have another glass of wine, and enjoy. Thank you, and thank you very much, David.